Hello, everyone. Santier here, and welcome to a sort of dev diary, I guess. So I've been working on my game, Psychopomps Are Missing. Some of you may have seen previous videos that I've done of playtests of this game, as well as one talking about how I made the character classes. There should be a playlist that I'll put in the cards. Yeah, it should be here-ish, with a link to that contains the playlist contains the videos that I'm discussing, and also will contain this one. But today I wanted to talk about sort of the process that I've been going through as I've been setting up Randomizer. So to give some context for my game, I have 8 different major world regions where there's going to be some sort of boss you have to defeat in order to be able to progress to where the final boss is, along with the requirement of rescuing a certain number of the titular missing Psychopomps. Or Psychopomps Are Missing is the working title. It'll have a different title, is my plan. So one of these regions is what I've been calling the mashup location. And the reason I've been calling it that is because it's a mashup of 2 locations. They're being mashed together. I'm a big fan of randomizers, at least in concept. I've only really played the Dark Souls 1 item randomizer and the Bloodstained one that's built in. But I really like the idea of entrance randomizers. And so the idea behind the mashup location is that there would be an entrance randomizer effect being applied to it. So when you go through a zone, it's randomized where it kind of goes. Now, this was a bit of a nebulous idea when I first proposed it, in terms of like, okay, that's a high-level concept, but what does that actually implementationally mean? And I thought it would be interesting to discuss that a little bit today, and just sort of the thought process that's gone through kind of turning that high-level, okay, this is going to be an entrance randomizer where areas are going to be smushed together, where you go through an entrance and you don't quite know where you're going to end up, taking that high-level concept and turning it into something that's beginning to get implemented. I'm still fairly early on in the process, but I'm beginning to get it implemented. So the first thing that I had to kind of determine, there's 2 big buckets of questions that I had to develop answers to. And the first one was, how am I going to actually make the maps, right? What is going to be my approach? And that might not sound like an obvious question, but there's a couple of things that I needed to keep in mind here. One of them is that I need enough maps with enough like entrances, or like transfer points, I guess we'll call them, going on, that it makes for something interesting to actually do. Like, if I have just like 3 big maps, then having randomization between, oh, did this take you to this one or that one? It's not very interesting. So I needed to have like enough maps, and I wanted them to be a bit smaller. Ashdala has a lot of large maps, and I want most of the rest of the areas to tend to be a little bit smaller than that. So what I've done here with this is need to think through, do I want to just have a bunch of pieces, right? Because I could approach the maps in 2 different ways. I could, at least 2 different ways that I thought of. There is very possibly more ways than that. But the 2 main ways that I thought of is I could either have maps where it's just like, here's a hallway, and here's another hallway, and one is skinned to belong to location 1, Idenomoth, and the other is location 2, Anorofrash. These names are mouthfuls because they are like words smashed together and turned into anagrams, so this just makes them weird. But so you're walking around in this area, and I haven't started working on any of the Anorofrash maps yet, but this is an Idenomoth. I don't know how I want to pronounce it exactly. You do your own take. I don't care. It's all, there's no voice acting in this game. That would be too much work. But you can see down here it's Eidenomouth. So, like, I could have, here's a section that's in Anorofrash is going to be more of a fantasy horror setting in some regards, whereas Idenomoth is more of sci-fi, as you can see. So it's very obvious when you go from one to the other, and there's going to be some other contrasts as well, in terms of like music and sound effects and weather and lighting and all that, right? As much as there's lighting in RPG Maker MV anyway, screen tinting, but there's going to be some pretty strong contrast between the 2. But as well as like enemies and things. There's going to be some overlapping enemy pool, but not completely. So the idea of having like, okay, there's strong contrast and these sorts of things. So it'd be pretty obvious when we go from something that belongs to one region versus another. But I could kind of approach it where it was like, okay, here's just a bunch of building blocks of like, here's, a town for this place, and here's a city block for this place, and you're kind of like, oh, I'm jumping between them. Or I could take the approach, which, like, that's a perfectly valid approach. I want to be really clear. Like, that's definitely a way that you could approach things. Having a bunch of pieces that are kind of just like being thrown together into the pile, and you're pulling ones out that kind of fit, works. But the way that I decided to do it is I'm going to make like a vanilla layout that then gets randomized. So I'm going to make like, okay, here's put together all of the maps for Idanemuth that are going to like fit together, and there's going to be like a logical way that they kind of fit together. I think that just makes for a more compelling randomizer rather than procedurally generated. This is an odd distinction. I hadn't thought about it until saying it just now, which is why I'm looking up at my thinking place, which exists over there in the corner of my room. But the procedurally generated is kind of more where you have the Lego blocks. And I think what makes a randomizer interesting is that there is the vanilla arrangement. And so you can see the vanilla arrangement, and like the fact that that's being warped is what's interesting about a randomizer as opposed to procedural generation. Anyway, that's the less interesting part in some regards, but there is some important stuff about making maps. This is a general principle in that you want your maps to be distinct and like stand out and be different from each other in some way. You want there to be landmark features and things that make it so that way they don't feel too samey or too much like the same thing. An example of kind of what I'm doing here is I have South Oak Street, where I have, this very deliberate area going off to this park off to the side, versus North Oak Street, which has this sort of deliberate bend and this little hidden side path that takes you somewhere that you can kind of see and get like clues that it's there. So when I have a bunch of things that are going to be city streets like this, I want to make sure, like, oh, you've got a section of a city street. I want to make sure that they feel distinct and different from each other, and not just like, I don't want them to all blend together. I don't want it to be like, here's yet another vertical street and here's yet another vertical street. But this is like a general principle, but it's very important for a randomizer that people are able to recognize the different maps that are being randomized and that they don't blend together too terribly much. So if you think about like Ocarina of Time randomizer, it's very distinct if you're in the Lost Woods versus if you're on Zora's River or whatever. But like I said, that's a general map making principle. What I think is actually most interesting about this is the coding methodology, the way that I'm doing randomization. Because I don't know if you've ever done a transfer in RPG Maker, MV, but normally, like, the easiest way to do one is go to Quick Event Creation. That's off of a right click for the context menu, or you can hit Control 1. But you click Transfer, you pick the location, you pick whether or not you retain. So, like, you'd open this up and be like, I want to go there. Like, that's the easy way to set up a transfer. You can also just go and make the transfer event. The nice thing about this one is it puts in the move sound effect by default, which is, I think it's useful. But that's not going to work for this. So what I kind of realized as I was thinking through the process of like, how am I going to do this randomization? I had a couple of important questions. Because again, high level, okay, things are being shuffled. Now there's an important additional detail here, which is that I wanted every X transfers the player does. Haven't determined X yet. That's going to be handled by a common event I'm going to be implementing later. Because I want to get the base layout all functional first, and then I'll randomize, like, set up the stuff for random. You'll see. We'll get into the code in a bit. But I want like every some number of times you transfer, and I'm probably going to randomize that slightly. It will reshuffle the world connections that are randomized. It'll reshuffle the randomized connections. So like I don't have to worry about making sure that there's paths to everywhere in the same sort of like logic sense, because that will kind of work itself out in theory anyway. So anyway, when you're doing that randomization step, you kind of need to ask the question of like, okay, how are you actually randomizing things though? And let me kind of walk you through like my sort of thought process. My initial idea was to have I just had a brain thought of adding that. Cool. Uh all I was doing there was trying to give the idea that this is shorter than that. But the uh initial concept that I had was that each area would have like my initial concept was I'd have a random number, and when you walked into a zone transition, it would have one of three locations, and it'd pick which one it was based upon ranges in that random number, and then I just re-randomize that number. So like a value between 0 and 100, and if it's like you walk into this one, if it's less than 50, it takes you to this location. If it's less than 70, it takes you to that, but more than 50, obviously. It takes you to that location. Otherwise, it takes you to this third location. But this one would care if it was like less than 33 and like less than 60. So like you'd get a slight mashup of things that way. That was kind of my initial concept, which has a lot of like bespoke arrangement of things. But I realized I kind of didn't fully like that idea, and also, I've also realized that that would not work super great, but it would mean that there would be a lot of like very distinct patterns and things. That's not what I ended up going with, but that was one method that I was considering for randomization. But that would potentially require a lot of planning and things like that as well. I need to make sure that, like, I mean, there's different ways that I could handle stuff. Like I could wait having things go to certain areas. So, in terms of being more likely, so it'd be more likely to go certain locations because maybe more things like will randomize to going there or things like that. But so there's some interest that you can get out of that sort of system. That's not what I ended up going with though. And so I thought some about how I was going to do things, and what I eventually decided and settled on is that I would kind of put everything into directional buckets. So, for example, this is a transfer going down. Like you travel down and then it takes you that way. So, what I've ended up doing is I've set things up so that way entrances are going to be shuffled amongst their directions. So, all of the down direction destinations will get shuffled amongst each other. All of the left, all of the right, and all of the up. Or you could think of them as north, south, east, and west. I tend to struggle a little bit with remembering which direction is west and which direction is east. I'm getting a little bit better, actually, at that, but because I've struggled with that, I just went with left and right. They're the same thing in this context. So, what I did for the code then is I've implemented a thing here to keep track of stuff. So I have an object. It has left, right, up, and down. These are destination objects. So this is an array of destination objects. And then I have translate functions. So what this looks like in like the game is you have this guy right here. I just have a script event that's transfer down. It's a down transfer. Now there's two numbers here. There's an index and an offset. So, and then there's the common event call. So and this is small. We'll look at the code in the thing, but just to give another example, this has an offset of +1. This has an offset of -2. So those are meaningful. So what I have here is I have these add transfer functions. I just wanted to make sure I had them above where I was trying to use them. And you can see I've implemented a lot more up and down. I think that there's going to be more up and down transfers in general, just because of the way RPG Maker works with building entrances, working best as a up-down situation. But all of these basically look more or less the same. They create this object of the map ID. So this is the destination X and Y coordinates, and then the maximum offset range. So this is specifically a range. You can see everything's -2 to 2 right now, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. And then I put it in my array of left, and then I make the translate. So all this is going to be, when I initially do it, is this is going to be, 0, 1, 2. It's just going to count like that. And what's going to happen is I have a function right here that's the mashup transfers. So this is, it randomizes them, right? The transfers. So this just has a bunch of array shuffling functions. Shuffle array, and that's this function right here, just to be complete with what I'm showing. So I grab, or I make a new array that's shuffled. I get the length of the array that we are going to shuffle, and then for each item in that, we grab one at random from it. We put it into that. Yeah, we put it. So we're going through the array that's being where the shuffled is going, and we're iterating through that, and we're grabbing some random index out of A, and we're sticking it into that slot. So we're just grabbing stuff at random from out there as we go across. And then we just replace that index because we're going to with whatever's at the end, and then we chop one off the end. So that way, we're basically like pulling random entries out and then like compressing A and kind of working through it. So you can feel free to, if you want a shuffle function. This may be destructive on the input array. So the array that you're entering into this, I'm not the biggest expert on JavaScript, but my supposition is that this is like a pointer / reference type, so this is probably destructive on the array that's being passed in. So you'd want to like reassign back out, which is what you can see I'm doing right here. I'm entering in the array and then I'm saving it over here, because the array is going to be destroyed in the process and make a new one effectively is what's happening. So I just shuffle all of these different directions, and this shuffles them within themselves. So this brings us to the transfer function. Now, there is a transfer for each direction. There's a subtle difference between basically the horizontal transfers and the vertical transfers, and that has to do with the offset. So to kind of explain the offset a bit more, actually, it would be helpful if I went to Emerald Street. So Emerald Street here, if I zoom in a bit, make it nice and big, you can see that there's a stairway at the end here. This is where I realized I needed to worry about offsets, and really think about this. So you come in and you have a destination from the Tetsugo ward that's going to drop you off in one of these spots based upon your offset. But this is going to be a left connection. It's stairs that you go in, down, and it takes you left, right? It's left facing. So this connection that currently is logically attached to right here could instead be logically attached to wherever this goes. But this is going to have a receiver of an offset maximum of like no offset, right? Maximum offset distance of 0, I guess, is technically what it's going to be. It's going to be 0, 0 for that array. I need to be able to handle going in an entrance one way and having the entrance you're going out be a different size. Specifically, like if it's bigger, that's fine. Like if you go in here and it gets randomized to here for some reason, which could happen, it's just going to go to this one because this is offset 0, right? Offset -1, -2, 1, and 2 because it counts going down. So this is 0 and this is 13. I guess you couldn't see me put it under my face, but the top row is 0. So it's counts down, which is, you just have to get used to it. When Windows programming does the same thing. So where the upper left corner is 0, 0 and the lower right corner is width, height, dimensionally speaking. So if I'm going in here and I'm getting popped out here, like that's fine. But if I'm going in, say, the equivalent of what would pop you out right here on the map side that's logically over here, and you get popped out in the middle of a void or a wall over here, going, wherever this ends up leading, that's not fine. So the offset allows me to have this be all one logical entrance because, again, I don't want you to go in one of these spots here and have it pop you out in a different location than going in this one would. Like, these should all be the same logical transfer. So no matter which one you go in, they should all take you to the same destination area, which is what it's set up to do. And the offset kind of facilitates that. But I needed smoothing. So what I have is I have this offset. So I first start by grabbing the So I have to do this whole translation thing. So I get the translated index. So this is the index that it's supposed to go to. Then I put it through the translation array. This allows me to be able to shuffle the translation array, which is, again, it's just basically a bunch of indexes, right? So by default, it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just counting down. Index 0 is a value of 0, etc. But after I shuffled it, it could be index 0 is 5, and then index 1 is 17, and then index 3 is 0 or whatever, rather than being 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, etc. Hopefully that made sense. And so I use this translation. It's much easier to shuffle just a set of numbers than it would be to shuffle the actual like objects that are getting stored in here, right? And so I grab that translated index, and I use that translated index to get my destination ID, the X, and I'm going to grab the Y, but I grab it right down here. This is for horizontal transfers. Horizontal transfers are going to use an offset on the Y. Vertical transfers use an offset on the X. So that's the difference between them. Is if we look at up, I instead have basically swapped Y and X here. That's what I did, is I swapped Y and X. And we'll talk about some of the other stuff in just a second. But I made the left and right ones first, and then I copied and pasted and did some adjustments. So, and I've tested things out, so it's working just fine. I didn't forget to change something from what I could tell. So the way that this works then is I grab the provided offset. If you did not give me an offset, which I'm always providing an offset, but if you didn't give me one, I just default to 0. This is a little bit of a null check, technically. And then if this offset, because remember destination Y has the offset, if it's less than the minimum for the maximum offset range, if it's less than the minimum, then we just set it to the minimum. If it's greater than the maximum, we just set it to the maximum. So this is this sort of smoothing function that kind of clamps the maximum offset. So if you're going into something that has a maximum range of like -1 to +2, because that's 4 and there's no middle point in 4, right? It doesn't have, like, if you stack 4 things up, the middle is in between 2 things, and we can't go in between 2 grids. So I have to pick one that I'm favoring. So if you're going in a spot that would a transfer that has like a range of 6, and you're going down to a range of 5 or a range of 4, then I can shrink you down to be as close to sort of where you entered as possible. And then I put in the actual like offset translation. So, basically normally you would apply the offset after the initial value, but it doesn't matter. It's addition. You can do it in either order. So I'm just doing it in this order because it makes processing a lot easier. And then I have this little bit of what's going on. So by default, I'm grabbing a fade of 1. This is the white fade. If you look at the transfer behavior. So if I just go to transfer, by default, yes, this is the transfer. So by default, it's direction retain, which is what I do, and then there's fade to black, and then there's fade to white, and then there's no fade. Fade to white is index 1, fade to black is index 0. I do not need this random move. So by default, I do a white fade, and I use the magic 1 sound effect. But if the index and the translated index are the same, then that means I'm doing a vanilla transfer. And so I use the fade to black and the move 1 sound effect instead. And then I just reserve the transfer and play the sound effect. And the sound effect takes this object here with the name and then volume, pitch, and pan. Reserve transfer reserves the transfer. And then that basically tells, as far as I understand it, because I'm not like 100% knowledgeable about every single detail of this engine by any means, but as far as I understand it, this basically is like, hey, I want to do this transfer, and then the system is like, oh, you're trying to transfer. I will process that. So 0 is just retain direction, and then the fade type. Null might work here as well. I just put 0 after I did some further investigation. But yeah, you just give it the destination, the X, the Y, and the direction of facing. This is 0 is retain, and then fade is the black transfer. or the white transfer, depending upon which it is. So one of the things that I'm doing here then is if it's a vanilla transfer, it has a standard like fade through black, standard move noise, just like most transitions have in the game. But if it's a shuffled transfer, it will in fact play a different sound effect and do a different fade. So there's kind of a neat thing that I'm doing there that I really like. And then there's just one of these for each direction. And that's kind of all that I'm really doing with the code. Just for posterity, you can see transfer up and down. Transfer up and down, the only difference between them is that one uses the down arrays and the other uses the up arrays. Same with the difference between left and right. So transfer right just uses the right arrays, the right directional arrays, and transfer left just uses the left ones. So that's kind of what I've set up for the code. And again, these are all like the same thing, just going into the appropriate arrays. So I'm very excited about this, and I look forward to having more of it complete, making sure all the vanilla stuff works properly, and actually beginning a randomization. But this is the process. And then I'm just adding, I add the transfers. This is one of the things that I'm doing this in code and just hard coding the transfer destinations because it's so much quicker and easier. You could, if you wanted to, theoretically, you could set this up to work off of like plugin commands instead of scripted function calls, and you could set this up to use the plugin manager variable management stuff. But that's so clunky, and it's just so much cleaner and easier, at least in my opinion, to just edit some code. So anyway, that's all I really wanted to talk about with this. So I might as well wrap up here. I'm looking forward to having this come together. I'm looking forward to playing around with the randomization. One final thing I'll add is the boss of this region is what's causing the randomization to happen. So when you defeat the boss, everything's going to stabilize, and the randomization will stop. What's happening lore-wise is there's the boss of this world region is that is not done. The boss of this world region is making the randomization happen and making everything kind of all shuffled. And when you defeat the boss, the randomization effect will end and everything will revert to just being a bunch of vanilla transfers. So that'll be exciting. Looking forward to it. So thank you all very much for watching. If you want to support me in the development of this project, you can go to my Patreon at patreon.com/Ciantier. There's a link down in the description. And until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.